Story 13 of Life's Little Ironies by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 13, Andrey, Satchel, and the Parson and Clerk. It all arose, you must know, from Andrey being fond of a drop of drink at that time, though he's a sober enough man now by all account, so much the better for him. Jane, his bride, you see, was somewhat older than Andrey. How much older I don't pretend to say. She was not one of our parish, and the register alone may be able to tell that. But at any rate, her being a little ahead of her young man in mortal years, coupled with other bodily circumstances— "Ah, poor thing," sighed the women— made her very anxious to get the thing done before he changed his mind, and 'twas with a joyful countenance, they say, that she, with Andrey and his brother and sister-in-law, marched off to church one November morning as soon as 'twas day a'most, to be made one with Andrey for the rest of her life. He had left our place long before it was light, and the folks that were up all waved their lanterns at him, and flung up their hats as he went. The church of her parish was a mile and more from the houses, and as it was a wonderful fine day for the time of year, the plan was that as soon as they were married they would make out a holiday by driving straight off to Port Bredy, to see the ships and sea and the sogers, instead of coming back to a meal at the house of the distant relation she lived with, and moping about there all the afternoon. Well, some folks noticed that Andrey walked with rather wambling steps to church that morning. The truth on it was that his nearest neighbour's child had been christened the day before, and Andrey, having stood godfather, had stayed all night keeping up the christening, for he had said to himself, "Not if I live to be 1,000 shall I again be made a godfather one day, and a husband the next, and perhaps a father the next, and therefore I'll make the most of the blessing." So that when he started from home in the morning he had not been in bed at all. The result was, as I say, that when he and his bride-to-be walked up the church to get married, the parson, who was a very strict man inside the church, whatever he was outside, looked hard at Andrey and said very sharp, "How's this, my man? You are in liquor, and so early, too. I'm ashamed of you." "Well, that's true, sir," said Andrey, "but I can walk straight enough for practical purposes. I can walk a chalk line," he says, meaning no offence, "as well as some other folk, and," getting hotter, "I reckon that if you, Parson Billy Toogood, had kept up a christening all night so thoroughly as I have done, you wouldn't be able to stand it all. Damned me if you would." This answer made Parson Billy, as they used to call him, rather spitish, not to say hot, for he was a warm-tempered man if provoked, and he said very decidedly, "Well, I cannot marry you in this state, and I will not. Go home and get sober." And he slapped the book together like a rat-trap. Then the bride burst out crying as if her heart would break, for very fear that she would lose Andrey after all her hard work to get him, and begged and implored the parson to go on with the ceremony. But no. "I won't be a party to your solemnizing matrimony with a tipsy man," says Mr. Toogood. "It is not right and decent. I am sorry for you, my young woman, but you'd better go home again. I wonder how you could think of bringing him here drunk like this." "But if he don't come drunk, he won't come at all, sir," she says through her sobs. "I can't help that," says the parson, and plead as she might, it did not move him. Then she tried him another way. "Well, then, if you'll go home, sir, and leave us here, and come back to the church in an hour or two, I'll undertake to say that he shall be as sober as a judge," she cries. "We'll abide here with your permission, for if he once goes out of this here church unmarried, all Van Amberg's horses won't drag him back again." "Very well," says the parson. "I'll give you 2 hours, and then I'll return." "And please, sir, lock the door so that we can't escape," says she. "Yes," says the parson. "And let nobody know that we are here." The parson then took off his clane white surplice and went away, and the others consulted upon the best means for keeping the matter a secret, which it was not a very hard thing to do, the place being so lonely and the hour so early. The witnesses, Andrey's brother and brother's wife, neither one of which cared about Andrey's marrying Jane, and had come rather against their will, said they couldn't wait 2 hours in that hole of a place, wishing to get home to Longpuddle before dinner-time. They were altogether so crusty that the clerk said there was no difficulty in their doing as they wished. They could go home as if their brother's wedding had actually taken place, and the married couple had gone onward for their day's pleasure jaunt to Port Bredy as intended. He, the clerk, and any casual passer-by would act as witness when the parson came back. This was agreed to, and away Andrey's relations went, nothing loath, and the clerk shut the church door and prepared to lock in the couple. The bride went up and whispered to him, with her eyes a-streamin' still. "My dear good clerk," she says, "if we bide here in the church, folk may see us through the winders, and find out what has happened, and 'twould cause such a talk and scandal that I never should get over it. And perhaps, too, dear Andrey might try to get out and leave me. Will you lock us up in the tower, my dear good clerk," she says. "I'll toll him in there, if you will." The clerk had no objection to do this to oblige the poor young woman, and they tolled Andrey into the tower, and the clerk locked 'em both up straightway, and then went home, to return at the end of the 2 hours. Parson Toogood had not been long in his house after leaving the church when he saw a gentleman in pink and top-boots ride past his windows, and with a sudden flash of heat he called to mind that the hounds met that day just on the edge of his parish. The parson was one who dearly loved sport, and much he longed to be there. In short, except o' Sundays and at tide times in the week, Parson Billy was the life of the hunt. 'Tis true that he was poor, and that he rode all of a heap, and that his black mare was rat-tailed and old, and his tops older and all over of one colour, whitey-brown, and full of cracks, but he'd been in at the death of 3,000 foxes, and being a bachelor man, every time he went to bed in summer he used to open the bed at bottom and crawl up head foremost, to mind in of the coming winter and the good sport he'd have, and the foxes going to earth. And whenever there was a christening at the squire's, and he had a dinner there afterwards, as he always did, he never failed to christen the child over again in a bottle of port wine. Now the clerk was the parson's groom and gardener and general manager, and had just got back to his work in the garden when he too saw the hunting man pass, and presently saw lots more of 'em, noblemen and gentry, and then he saw the hounds, the huntsman, Jim Treddage, the whipper-in, and I don't know who besides. The clerk loved going to cover as frantical as the parson, so much so that whenever he saw or heard the pack, he could do no more rule his feelings than if they were the winds of heaven. He might be bedding, or he might be sewing, all was forgot. So he throws down his spade and rushes into the parson, who was by this time as frantical to go as he. "That there mare of yours, sir, do want exercise bad, very bad this morning," the clerk says, all of a tremble. "Don't you think I'd better trot her round the downs for an hour, sir?" "To be sure, she does want exercise badly. I'll trot her round myself," says the parson. "Oh, you'll trot her yourself? Well, there's the cob, sir. Really, that cob is getting uncontrollable through biding in a stable so long. If you wouldn't mind my putting on the saddle—" "Oh, very well. Take him out, certainly," says the parson, never caring what the clerk did so long as he himself could get off immediately. So, scrambling into his riding boots and breeches as quick as he could, he rode off towards the meet, intending to be back in an hour. No sooner was he gone than the clerk mounted the cob and was off after him. When the parson got to the meet he found a lot of friends, and was as jolly as he could be. The hounds found almost as soon as they threw off, and there was great excitement. So, forgetting that he had meant to go back at once, away rides the parson with the rest of the hunt, all across the fallow ground that lies between Lippet Wood and Green's Copse, and as he galloped he looked behind for a moment, and there was the clerk close to his heels. "Ha ha, clerk, you here?" he says. "Yes, sir, here I be," says t'other. "Fine exercise for the horses." "Ay, sir, he, says the clerk. So they went on and on into Green's Copse, then across to Higher Jirton, then on across this very turnpike road to Climmerston Ridge, then away towards Yalbury Wood, up hill and down dale, like the very wind, the clerk close to the parson, and the parson not far from the hounds. Never was there a finer run knowed with that pack than they had that day, and neither parson nor clerk thought one word about the unmarried couple locked up in the church tower, waiting to get janned. "These hosses of yours, sir, will be much improved by this," says the clerk as he rode along, just a neck behind the parson. "'Twas a happy thought of your reverent mind to bring 'em out to-day. Why, it may be frosty in a day or two, and then the poor things might not be able to leave the stable for weeks." "They may not, it is true. A merciful man is merciful to his beast," says the parson. "He," says the clerk, glancing sly into the parson's eye. "Ha, ha," says the parson, a-glancing back into the clerk's. "Halloo!" he shouts, as he sees the fox break cover at that moment. "Halloo!" cries the clerk. "There he goes! Why, dammy, there's two foxes!" "Hush, clerk, hush! Don't let me hear that word again. Remember our calling." "True, sir, true. But really, good sport do carry away a man so, that he's apt to forget his high persuasion." And the next minute the corner of the clerk's eye shot again into the corner of the parson's, and the parson's back again to the clerk's. "He," said the clerk. "He," said Parson Toogood. "Ah, sir," says the clerk again, "this is better than crying amen to you ever and ever on a winter's morning." "Yes, indeed, clerk, to everything there's a season," says Parson Toogood, quite pat, for he was a learned Christian man when he liked, and had chapter and verse in his tongue end, as a parson should. At last, late in the day, the hunting came to an end by the fox running into an old woman's cottage under her table and up the clock case. The parson and clerk were among the first in at the death, their faces a-staring in at the old woman's winder, and the clock striking as he'd never been heard to strike before. Then came the question of finding their way home. Neither the parson nor the clerk knowed how they were going to do this, for their beasts were well nigh tired down to the ground. But they started back along as well as they could, though they were so done up that they could only drag along at a amble, and not much of that at a time. "We shall never, never get there," groaned Mr. Toogood, quite bowed down. "Never," groans the clerk. "'Tis a judgment upon us for our iniquities." "I fear it is," murmurs the parson. Well, 'twas quite dark afore they entered the parsonage gate, having crept into the parish as quiet as if they'd stole a hammer, little wishing their congregation to know what they'd been up to all day long. And as they were so dog-tired and so anxious about the horses, never once did they think of the unmarried couple. As soon as ever the horses had been stabled and fed, and the parson and clerk had had a bit and a sup themselves, they went to bed. Next morning, when Parson Toogood was at breakfast, thinking of the glorious sport he'd had the day before, the clerk came in a hurry to the door and asked to see him. "It has just come into my mind, sir, that we forgot all about the couple that we was to have married yesterday." The half-chawed victuals dropped from the parson's mouth as if he'd been shot. "Bless my soul," says he, "so we have. How very awkward." "It is, sir, very. Perhaps we've ruined the 'ooman." "Ah, to be sure, I remember. She ought to have been married before. If anything has happened to her up in that there tower, and no doctor or nuss—" "Ah, poor thing," sighed the women. "'Twill be a quarter-sessions matter for us, not to speak of the disgrace to the church." "Good God, clerk, don't drive me wild," says the parson. "Why the hell didn't I marry him drunk or sober?" Parson used to cuss in them days like plain honest men. "Have you been to the church to see what happened to 'em, or inquired in the village?" "Not I, sir. It only came into my head a moment ago, and I always like to be second to you in church matters. You could have knocked me down with a sparrow's feather when I thought it, sir. I assure ye you could." Well, the parson jumped up from his breakfast, and together they went off to the church. "It is not at all likely that they are there now," says Mr. Toogood as they went, "and indeed I hope they are not. They be pretty sure to have 'scaped and gone home." However, they opened the church hatch, entered the churchyard, and looking up at the tower, there they seed a small white face at the belfry winder, and a little small hand waving. 'Twas the bride. "God my life, Clerk," says Mr. Toogood, "I don't know how to face 'em." And he sank down upon a tombstone. "How I wish I hadn't been so cussed particular." "Yes, 'twas a pity we didn't finish it when we'd begun," the clerk said. "Still, since the feelin's of your holy priestcraft wouldn't let ye, the couple must put up with it." "True, Clerk, true. Does she look as if anything premature had took place?" "I can't see her no lower down than her armpit, sir." "Well, how do her face look?" "It do look mighty white." "Well, we must know the worst. Dear me, how the small of my back do ache from that ride yesterday. But to more godly business." They went on into the church and unlocked the tower stairs, and immediately poor Jane and Andrey burst out like starved mice from a cupboard, Andrey limp and sober enough now, and his bride pale and cold, but otherwise as usual. "What?" says the parson, with a great breath of relief. "You haven't been here ever since?" "Yes, we have, sir," says the bride, sinking down upon a seat in her weakness. "Not a morsel, wet or dry, have we had since. It was impossible to get out without help, and here we've stayed." "But why didn't you shout, good souls?" said the parson. "She wouldn't let me," says Andrey. "Because we was so ashamed at what had led to it," sobs Jane. "We felt that if it were noised about it would cling to us all our lives. Once or twice Andrey had a good mind to toll the bell, but then he said, 'No, I'll starve first. I won't bring disgrace on my name and yours, my dear.' And so we waited and waited, and walked round and round, but never did you come till now." "To my regret," says the parson. "Now then, we shall soon get it over." I should like some victuals," said Andrey. "'Twould give me courage if it is only a crust of bread and an onion, for I am that leery that I can feel my stomach rubbing against my backbone." "I think we'd better get it done," said the bride, a bit anxious in manner, "since we are all here convenient, too." Andrey gave way about the victuals, and the clerk called in a second witness who wouldn't be likely to gossip about it, and soon the knot was tied, and the bride looked smiling and calm forthwith, and Andrey limper than ever. "Now," said Parson Toogood, "you two must come to my house and have a good linin' put to your insides before you go a step further." They were very glad of the offer, and went out of the churchyard by one path while the parson and clerk went out by the other, and so did not attract notice, it being still early. They entered the rectory as if they'd just come back from their trip to Port Bredy, and then they knocked in the victuals and drink till they could hold no more. It was a long while before the story of what they had gone through was known, but it was talked of in time, and they themselves laugh over it now, though what Jane got for her pains was no great bargain after all. 'Tis true, she saved her name. "Was that the same Andrey who went to the squire's house as one of the Christmas fiddlers?" asked the seedsman. "Oh, no," replied Mr. Prophet, the schoolmaster. "It was his father did that. It was all owing to his being such a man for eating and drinking." Finding that he had the ear of the audience, the schoolmaster continued without delay. End of Story 13. Story 14 of Life's Little Ironies by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 14. Old Andrey's Experience as a Musician. I was one of the choir boys at that time, and we and the players were to appear at the manor house as usual that Christmas week, to play and sing in the hall to the squire's people and visitors, among 'em being the Archdeacon, Lord and Lady Bagsby, and I don't know who. Afterwards going, as we always did, to have a good supper in the servants' hall. Andrew knew this was the custom, and meeting us when we were starting to go, he said to us, "Lord, how I should like to join in that meal of beef and turkey and plum pudding and ale that you happy ones be going to just now." One more or less will make no difference to the squire. I am too old to pass as a singing boy, and too bearded to pass as a singing girl. Can ye lend me a fiddle, neighbours, that I may come with ye as a bandsman?" Well, we didn't like to be hard upon him, and lent him an old one, though Andrew knew no more of music than the Surney giant, and armed with the instrument we walked up to the squire's house with the others of us at the time appointed, and went in boldly, his fiddle under his arm. He made himself as natural as he could in opening the music books and moving the candles to the best points for throwing light upon the notes, and all went well till we had played and sung While Shepherds Watch, and Star Arise, and Hark the Glad Sound. Then the squire's mother, a tall, gruff old lady, who was much interested in church music, said quite unexpectedly to Andrew, "My man, I see you don't play your instrument with the rest. How is that?" Every one of the choir was ready to sink into the earth with concern at the fix Andrew was in. We could see that he had fallen into a cold sweat, and how he would get out of it we did not know. "I've got a misfortune, ma'am," he says, bowing as meek as a child. "Coming along the road I fell down and broke my bow." "Oh, I am sorry to hear that," says she. "Can't it be mended?" "Oh, no, ma'am," says Andrew. "'Twas broke all to splinters." "I'll see what I can do for you," says she. And then it seemed all over, and we played "Rejoice, ye drowsy mortals all," in D and two sharps, but no sooner had we got through it than she says to Andrew, "I've sent up into the attic where we have some old musical instruments and found a bow for you." And she hands the bow to poor wretched Andrew, who didn't even know which end to take hold of. "Now we shall have the full accompaniment," says she. Andrew's face looked as if it were made of rotten apple as he stood in the circle of players in front of his book, for if there was one person in the parish that everybody was afraid of, 'twas this hook-nosed old lady. However, by keeping a little behind the next man, he managed to make pretence of beginning, sawing away with his bow without letting it touch the strings, so that it looked as if he were driving into the tune with heart and soul. 'Tis a question if he wouldn't have got through all right if one of the squire's visitors, no other than the archdeacon, hadn't noticed that he held the fiddle upside down, the nut under his chin, and the tail-piece in his hand, and they began to crowd round him, thinking 'twas some new way of performing. This revealed everything. The squire's mother had Andrew turned out of the house as a vile impostor, and there was great interruption to the harmony of the proceedings, the squire declaring he should have notice to leave his cottage that day fortnight. However, when we got to the servants' hall, there sat Andrew, who had been let in at the back door by the orders of the squire's wife, after being turned out at the front by the orders of the squire, and nothing more was heard about his leaving his cottage. But Andrew never performed in public as a musician after that night, and now he's dead and gone, poor man, as we all shall be. "I had quite forgotten the old choir, with their fiddles and bass viols," said the home-comer musingly. "Are they still going on the same as of old?" "Bless them, man," said Christopher Twink, the master thatcher. "Why, they've been done away with these 20 year. A young teetotaler plays the organ in church now, and plays it very well, though 'tis not quite such good music as in old times, because the organ is one of them that go with a winch, and the young teetotaler says he can't always throw the proper feeling into the tune without well-nigh working his arms off." "Why did they make the change, then?" "Well, partly because of a fashion, partly because the old musicians got into a sort of scrape. A terrible scrape 'twas too, wasn't it, John? I shall never forget it, never. They lost their character as officers of the church, as complete as if they'd never had any character at all." "Oh, that was very bad for them." "Oh, yes." The master thatcher attentively regarded past times as if they lay about a mile off, and went on. End of Story 14. Story 15 of Life's Little Ironies by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 15, Absent-Mindedness in a Parish Choir. It happened on Sunday after Christmas, the last Sunday ever they played in Longpuddle church gallery, as it turned out, though they didn't know it then. As you may know, sir, the players formed a very good band, almost as good as the Mellstock parish players that were led by the Deweys, and that's saying a great deal. There was Nicholas Puddingcombe, the leader, with the first fiddle. There was Timothy Thomas, the bass viol man, John Biles, the tenor fiddler, Dan'l Hornhead with the serpent, Robert Dowdle with the clarinet, and Mr. Nix with the oboe. All sound and powerful musicians and strong-winded men, they that blowed. For that reason they were very much in demand Christmas week for little reels and dancing parties, for they could turn a jig or a hornpipe out of hand as well as ever they could turn out a psalm, and perhaps better, not to speak irreverent. In short, one half-hour they could be playing a Christmas carol in the Squire's hall to the ladies and gentlemen, and drinking tea and coffee with 'em as modest as saints, and the next at the Tinker's Arms, blazing away like wild horses with the dashing white Sargent, to 9 couple of dancers and more, and swallowing rum and cider hot as flame. Well, this Christmas they'd been out to one rattling randy after another every night, and had got next to no sleep at all. Then came the Sunday after Christmas, their fatal day. 'Twas so mortal cold that year that they could hardly sit in the gallery, for though the congregation down in the body of the church had a stove to keep off the frost, the players in the gallery had nothing at all. So Nicholas said at morning service, when 'twas freezing an inch an hour, "Please the Lord, I won't stand this numbing weather no longer. This afternoon we'll have something in our insides to make us warm, if it cost a king's ransom." So he brought a gallon of hot brandy and beer, ready mixed, to church with him in the afternoon, and by keeping the jar well wrapped up in Timothy Thomas's bass viol bag, it kept drinkably warm till they wanted it, which was just a thimbleful in the absolution, and another after the creed, and the remainder at the beginning o' the sermon. When they'd had the last pull they felt quite comfortable and warm, and as the sermon went on, most unfortunately for 'em, it was a long one that afternoon, they fell asleep, every man jack of 'em, and there they slept on as sound as rocks. 'Twas a very dark afternoon, and by the end of the sermon all you could see of the inside of the church were the pa'son's 2 candles alongside of him in the pulpit, and his spaking face behind 'em. The sermon being ended at last, the parson geet out the evening hymn, but no choir set about sounding up the tune, and the people began to turn their heads to learn the reason why, and then Levi Limpet, a boy who sat in the gallery, nudged Timothy and Nicholas and said, "Begin, begin." "Eh, what?" says Nicholas, starting up, and the church being so dark and his head so muddled, he thought he was at the party they had played at the night before, and away he went, bow and fiddle, at "The Devil Among the Tailors," the favourite jig of our neighbourhood at that time. The rest of the band, being in the same state of mind and nothing doubting, followed their leader with all their strength according to custom. They poured out that there tune till the lower bass notes of "The Devil Among the Tailors" made the cobwebs in the roof shiver like ghosts. Then Nicholas, seeing nobody moved, shouted out as he scraped, in his usual commanding way at dances when the folk don't know the figures, "Top couples cross hands, and when I make the fiddle squeak at the end, every man kiss his partner under the mistletoe." The boy Levi was so frightened that he bolted down the gallery stairs and out homeward like lightning. The parson's hair fairly stood on end when he heard the evil tune raging through the church, and thinking the choir had gone crazy, he held up his hand and said, "Stop, stop, 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 stop! What's this?" But they didn't hear him for the noise of their own playing, and the more he called, the louder they played. Then the folks came out of their pews, wondering down to the ground, and saying, "What do they mean by such wickedness? We shall be consumed like Sodom and Gomorrah." Then the squire came out of his pew lined with green baize, where lots of lords and ladies visiting at the house were worshipping along with him, and went and stood in front of the gallery and shook his fist in the musicians' faces, saying, "What, in this reverent edifice? What?" And at last they heard 'en through their playing, and stopped. "Never such an insulting, disgraceful thing, never," says the squire, who couldn't rule his passion. "Never," says the parson, who had come down and stood beside him. "Not if the angels of heaven," says the squire, who was a wickedish man, the squire was, though now for once he happened to be on the Lord's side. "Not if the angels of heaven come down," he says, "shall one of you villainous players ever sound a note in this church again, for the insult to me and my family and my visitors and God Almighty that you've perpetrated this afternoon." Then the unfortunate church band came to their senses, and remembered where they were, and 'twas a sight to see Nicholas Pudding come and Timothy Thomas and John Biles creep down the gallery stairs with their fiddles under their arms, and poor Daniel Hornhead with his serpent, and Robert Dowdle with his clarinet, all looking as little as ninepins, and out they went. The parson might have forgive 'em when he learned the truth o't, but the squire would not. That very week he sent for a barrel organ that would play 22 new psalm tunes, so exact and particular that however sinful inclined you was, you could play nothing but psalm tunes whatsomever. He had a really respectable man to turn the winch, as I said, and the old players played no more. And, of course, my old acquaintance, the annuitant Mrs. Winter, who always seemed to have something on her mind, is dead and gone?" said the home-comer, after a long silence. Nobody in the van seemed to recollect the name. "Oh, yes, she must be dead long since. She was 70 when I, as a child, knew her," he added. "I can recollect Mrs. Winter very well, if nobody else can," said the aged groceress. "Yes, she's been dead these 25 year at least. You knew what it was upon her mind, sir, that gave her that hollow-eyed look, I suppose?" "It had something to do with a son of hers, I think I once was told, but I was too young to know the particulars." The groceress sighed as she conjured up a vision of days long past. "Yes," she murmured, "it had all to do with a son." Finding that the van was still in a listening mood, she spoke on. End of Story 15. Story 16 of Life's Little Ironies by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 16, The Winters and the Palmleys. To go back to the beginning, if one must, there were 2 women in the parish when I was a child, who were to a certain extent rivals in good looks. Never mind particulars, but in consequence of this they were at daggers drawn, and they did not love each other any better when one of them tempted the other's lover away from her and married him. He was a young man of the name of Winter, and in due time they had a son. The other woman did not marry for many years, but when she was about 30, a quiet man named Palmley asked her to be his wife, and she accepted him. You don't mind when the Palmleys were Longpuddle folk, but I do well. She had a son also, who was, of course, 9 or 10 years younger than the son of the first. The child proved to be of rather weak intellect, though his mother loved him as the apple of her eye. This woman's husband died when the child was 8 years old, and left his widow and boy in poverty. Her former rival, also a widow now, but fairly well provided for, offered for pity's sake to take the child as errand-boy, small as he was, her own son Jack being hard upon 17. Her poor neighbour could do no better than let the child go there, and to the richer woman's house little Palmley straightway went. Well, in some way or other, how it was never exactly known, the thriving woman, Mrs. Winter, sent the little boy with a message to the next village one December day, much against his will. It was getting dark, and the child prayed to be allowed not to go, because he would be afraid coming home. But the mistress insisted, more out of thoughtlessness than cruelty, and the child went. On his way back he had to pass through Yalbury Wood, and something came out from behind a tree and frightened him into fits. The child was quite ruined by it. He became quite a drivelling idiot, and soon afterward died. Then the other woman had nothing left to live for, and vowed vengeance against that rival who had first won away her lover, and now had been the cause of her bereavement. This last affliction was certainly not intended by her thriving acquaintance, though it must be owned that when it was done she seemed but little concerned. Whatever vengeance poor Mrs. Palmley felt, she had no opportunity of carrying it out, and time might have softened her feelings into forgetfulness of her supposed wrongs as she dragged on her lonely life. So matters stood when, a year after the death of the child, Mrs. Palmley's niece, who had been born and bred in the city of Exonbury, came to live with her. This young woman, Miss Harriet Palmley, was a proud and handsome girl, very well brought up, and more stylish and genteel than the people of our village, as was natural, considering where she came from. She regarded herself as much above Mrs. Winter and her son in position as Mrs. Winter and her son considered themselves above poor Mrs. Palmley. But love is an unceremonious thing, and what in the world should happen but that young Jack Winter must fall woefully and wildly in love with Harriet Palmley almost as soon as he saw her. She, being better educated than he, and caring nothing for the village notion of his mother's superiority to her aunt, did not give him much encouragement. But Longpuddle being no very large world, the two could not help seeing a good deal of each other while she was staying there, and, disdainful young woman as she was, she did seem to take a little pleasure in his attentions and advances. One day, when they were picking apples together, he asked her to marry him. She had not expected anything so practical as that at so early a time, and was led by her surprise into a half-promise. At any rate, she did not absolutely refuse him, and accepted some little presents that he made her. But he saw that her view of him was rather as a simple village lad than as a young man to look up to, and he felt that he must do something bold to secure her. So he said one day, "I am going away to try to get into a better position than I can get here." In 2 or 3 weeks he wished her good-bye, and went away to Monksbury to superintend a farm, with a view to start as a farmer himself, and from there he wrote regularly to her, as if their marriage were an understood thing. Now Harriet liked the young man's presence and the admiration of his eyes, but on paper he was less attractive to her. Her mother had been a schoolmistress, and Harriet had besides a natural aptitude for pen and ink work, in days when to be a ready writer was not such a common thing as it is now, and when actual handwriting was valued as an accomplishment in itself. Jack Winter's performances in the shape of love letters quite jarred her city nerves and her finer taste, and when she answered one of them in the lovely running hand that she took such pride in, she very strictly and loftily bade him to practise with a pen and spelling-book if he wished to please her. Whether he listened to her request or not nobody knows, but his letters did not improve. He ventured to tell her in his clumsy way that if her heart were more warm towards him she would not be so nice about his handwriting and spelling, which indeed was true enough. Well, in Jack's absence the weak flame that had been set alight in Harriet's heart soon sank low, and at last went out altogether. He wrote and begged and prayed her to give a reason for her coldness, and then she told him plainly that she was town-born, and he was not sufficiently well educated to please her. Jack Winter's want of pen and ink training did not make him less thin-skinned than others. In fact, he was terribly tender and touchy about anything. This reason that she gave for finally throwing him over grieved him, shamed him, and mortified him more than can be told in these times, the pride of that day in being able to write with beautiful flourishes, and the sorrow at not being able to do so raging so high. Jack replied to her with an angry note, and then she hit back with smart little stings, telling him how many words he had misspelt in his last letter, and declaring again that this alone was sufficient justification for any woman to put an end to an understanding with him. Her husband must be a better scholar. He bore her rejection of him in silence, but his suffering was sharp, all the sharper in being untold. She communicated with Jack no more, and as his reason for going out into the world had been only to provide a home worthy of her, he had no further object in planning such a home now that she was lost to him. He therefore gave up the farming occupation by which he had hoped to make himself a master farmer, and left the spot to return to his mother. As soon as he got back to Longpuddle he found that Harriet had already looked with favour upon another lover. He was a young road contractor, and Jack could not but admit that his rival was both in manners and scholarship much ahead of him. Indeed, a more sensible match for the beauty who had been dropped into the village by fate could hardly have been found than this man, who could offer her so much better a chance than Jack could have done, with his uncertain future and narrow abilities for grappling with the world. The fact was so clear to him that he could hardly blame her. One day, by accident, Jack saw on a scrap of paper the handwriting of Harriet's new beloved. It was flowing like a stream, well spelt, the work of a man accustomed to the ink bottle and the dictionary, of a man already called in the parish a good scholar. And then it struck all of a sudden into Jack's mind what a contrast the letters of this young man must make to his own miserable old letters, and how ridiculous they must make his lines appear. He groaned and wished he had never written to her, and wondered if she had ever kept his poor performances. Possibly she had kept them, for women are in the habit of doing that, he thought, and whilst they were in her hands there was always a chance of his honest, stupid love assurances to her being joked over by Harriet with her present lover, or by anybody who should accidentally uncover them. The nervous, moody young man could not bear the thought of it, and at length decided to ask her to return them, as was proper when engagements were broken off. He was some hours in framing, copying, and recopying the short note in which he made his request, and having finished it he sent it to her house. His messenger came back with the answer, by word of mouth, that Miss Palmley bade him say she should not part with what was hers, and wondered at his boldness in troubling her. Jack was much affronted at this, and determined to go for his letters himself. He chose a time when he knew she was at home, and knocked and went in without much ceremony, for though Harriet was so high and mighty, Jack had small respect for her aunt, Mrs. Palmley, whose little child had been his boot-cleaner in earlier days. Harriet was in the room, this being the first time they had met since she had jilted him. He asked for his letters with a stern and bitter look at her. At first she said he might have them for all that she cared, and took them out of the bureau where she kept them. Then she glanced over the outside one of the packet, and, suddenly altering her mind, she told him shortly that his request was a silly one, and slipped the letters into her aunt's work-box, which stood open on the table, locking it, and saying with a bantering laugh that of course she thought it best to keep 'em, since they might be useful to produce as evidence that she had good cause for declining to marry him. He blazed up hot. "Give me those letters," he said. "They are mine." "No, they are not," she replied. "They are mine." "Whosoever they are, I want 'em back," says he. "I don't want to be made sport of for my penmanship. You've another young man now. He has your confidence, and you pour all your tales into his ear. You'll be showing them to him." "Perhaps," said my Lady Harriet, with calm coolness, like the heartless woman that she was. Her manner so maddened him that he made a step towards the work-box, but she snatched it up, locked it in the bureau, and turned upon him triumphant. For a moment he seemed to be going to wrench the key of the bureau out of her hand, but he stopped himself, and swung round upon his heel, and went away. When he was out of doors alone, and it got night, he walked about restless, and stinging with the sense of being beaten at all points by her. He could not help fancying her telling her new lover or her acquaintances of this scene with himself, and laughing with them over those poor blotted crooked lines of his that he had been so anxious to obtain. As the evening passed on, he worked himself into a dogged resolution to have them back at any price, come what might. At the dead of night he came out of his mother's house by the back door, and creeping through the garden hedge went along the field adjoining till he reached the back of her aunt's dwelling. The moon struck bright and flat upon the walls, 'twas said, and every shiny leaf of the creepers was like a little looking-glass in the rays. From long acquaintance Jack knew the arrangement and position of everything in Mrs. Palmley's house as well as in his own mother's. The back window close to him was a casement with little leaded squares, as it is to this day, and was, as now, one of two lighting the sitting-room. The other, being in front, was closed up with shutters, but this back one had not even a blind, and the moonlight, as it streamed in, showed every article of the furniture to him outside. To the right of the room is the fireplace, as you may remember. To the left was the bureau at that time. Inside the bureau was Harriet's work-box, as he supposed, though it was really her aunt's, and inside the work-box were his letters. Well, he took out his pocket-knife and without noise lifted the leading of one of the panes, so that he could take out the glass, and putting his hand through the hole he unfastened the casement and climbed in through the opening. All the household, that is to say, Mrs. Palmley, Harriet, and the little maid-servant, were asleep. Jack went straight to the bureau, so he said, hoping it might have been unfastened again, it not being kept locked in ordinary. But Harriet had never unfastened it since she secured her letters there the day before. Jack told afterward how he thought of her asleep upstairs, caring nothing for him, and of the way she had made sport of him and of his letters; and having advanced so far, he was not to be hindered now. By forcing the large blade of his knife under the flap of the bureau, he burst the weak lock. Within was the rosewood work-box, just as she had placed it in her hurry to keep it from him. There being no time to spare for getting the letters out of it then, he took it under his arm, shut the bureau, and made the best of his way out of the house, latching the casement behind him, and refixing the pane of glass in its place. Winter found his way back to his mother's as he had come, and, being dog-tired, crept upstairs to bed, hiding the box till he could destroy its contents. The next morning early he set about doing this, and carried it to the linhay at the back of his mother's dwelling. Here by the hearth he opened the box, and began burning one by one the letters that had cost him so much labour to write and shame to think of, meaning to return the box to Harriet after repairing the slight damage he had caused it by opening it without a key, with a note, the last she would ever receive from him, telling her triumphantly that in refusing to return what he had asked for, she had calculated too surely upon his submission to her whims. But on removing the last letter from the box he received a shock, for underneath it at the very bottom lay money, several golden guineas. Doubtless Harriet's pocket-money, he said to himself, though it was not, but Mrs. Palmley's. Before he had got over his qualms at this discovery, he heard footsteps coming through the house passage to where he was. In haste he pushed the box and what was in it under some brushwood which lay in the linhay, but Jack had been already seen. 2 constables entered the outhouse and seized him as he knelt before the fireplace, securing the work-box and all it contained at the same moment. They had come to apprehend him on a charge of breaking into the dwelling-house of Mrs. Palmley on the night preceding, and almost before the lad knew what had happened to him they were leading him along the lane that connects that end of the village with this turnpike road, and along they marched him between 'em all the way to Casterbridge jail. Jack's act amounted to night burglary, though he had never thought of it, and burglary was felony and a capital offence in those days. His figure had been seen by some one against the bright wall as he came away from Mrs. Palmley's back window, and the box and money were found in his possession, while the evidence of the broken bureau lock and tinkered window-pane was more than enough for circumstantial detail. Whether his protestation that he went only for his letters, which he believed to be wrongfully kept from him, would have availed him anything if supported by other evidence, I do not know, but the one person who could have borne it out was Harriet, and she acted entirely under the sway of her aunt. That aunt was deadly towards Jack Winter. Mrs. Palmley's time had come. Here was her revenge upon the woman who had first won away her lover, and next ruined and deprived her of her heart's treasure, her little son. When the next assize week drew on, and Jack had to stand his trial, Harriet did not appear in the case at all, which was allowed to take its course, Mrs. Palmley testifying to the general facts of the burglary. Whether Harriet would have come forward if Jack had appealed to her is not known. Possibly she would have done it for pity's sake. But Jack was too proud to ask a single favour of a girl who had jilted him, and he let her alone. The trial was a short one, and the death sentence was passed. The day of young Jack's execution was a cold, dusty Saturday in March. He was so boyish and slim that they were obliged in mercy to hang him in the heaviest fetters kept in the jail, lest his heft should not break his neck, and they weighed so upon him that he could hardly drag himself up to the drop. At that time the government was not strict about burying the body of an executed person within the precincts of the prison, and at the earnest prayer of his poor mother his body was allowed to be brought home. All the parish waited at their cottage doors in the evening for its arrival. I remember how, as a very little girl, I stood by my mother's side. About 8 o'clock, as we hearkened on our door-stones in the cold, bright starlight, we could hear the faint crackle of a wagon from the direction of the turnpike road. The noise was lost as the wagon dropped into a hollow, then it was plain again as it lumbered down the next long incline, and presently it entered Longpuddle. The coffin was laid in the belfry for the night, and the next day, Sunday, between the services, we buried him. A funeral sermon was preached the same afternoon, the text chosen being, "He was the only son of his mother, and she was a widow." Oh yes, they were cruel times. As for Harriet, she and her lover were married in due time, but by all account her life was no jocund one. She and her goodman found that they could not live comfortably at Longpuddle by reason of her connection with Jack's misfortunes, and they settled in a distant town, and were no more heard of by us. Mrs. Palmley, too, found it advisable to join 'em shortly after. The dark-eyed, gaunt old Mrs. Winter, remembered by the immigrant gentleman here, was, as you will have foreseen, the Mrs. Winter of this story, and I can well call to mind how lonely she was, how afraid the children were of her, and how she kept herself as a stranger among us, though she lived so long. "Longpuddle has had her sad experiences as well as her sunny ones," said Mr. Lackland. "Yes, yes, but I am thankful to say not many like that, though good and bad have lived among us. There was George Crookhill. He was one of the shady sort, as I have reason to know," observed the registrar, with the manner of a man who would like to have his say also. "I used to hear what he was as a boy at school." "Well, as he began, so he went on. It never got so far as a hanging matter with him, to be sure, but he had some narrow escapes of penal servitude, and once it was a case of the biter bit." End of Story 16. Story 17 of Life's Little Ironies by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 17, Incident in the Life of Mr. George Crookhill. One day, the registrar continued, Georgie was ambling out of Melchester on a miserable screw, the fair being just over, when he saw in front of him a fine-looking young farmer riding out of the town in the same direction. He was mounted on a good, strong, handsome animal, worth 50 guineas if worth a crown. When they were going up Bissett Hill, Georgie made it his business to overtake the young farmer. They passed the time of day to one another. Georgie spoke of the state of the roads, and jogged alongside the well-mounted stranger in very friendly conversation. The farmer had not been inclined to say much to Georgie at first, but by degrees he grew quite affable too, as friendly as Georgie was toward him. He told Crookhill that he had been doing business at Melchester Fair, and was going on as far as Shottsford Forum that night, so as to reach Casterbridge Market the next day. When they came to Woodyates Inn they stopped to bait their horses, and agreed to drink together. With this they got more friendly than ever, and on they went again. Before they had nearly reached Shottsford it came on to rain, and as they were now passing through the village of Trantridge, and it was quite dark, Georgie persuaded the young farmer to go no further that night. The rain would most likely give him a chill. For his part he had heard that the little inn here was comfortable, and he meant to stay. At last the young farmer agreed to put up there also, and they dismounted and entered and had a good supper together, and talked over their affairs like men who had known and proved each other over a long time. When it was the hour for retiring, they went upstairs to a double-bedded room which Georgie Crookhill had asked the landlord to let them share, so sociable were they. Before they fell asleep they talked across the room about one thing and another, running from this to that till the conversation turned upon disguises, and changing clothes for particular ends. The farmer told Georgie that he had often heard tales of people doing it, but Crookhill professed to be very ignorant of all such tricks, and soon the young farmer sank into slumber. Early in the morning, while the tall young farmer was still asleep, I tell the story as 'twas told me. Honest Georgie crept out of his bed by stealth, and dressed himself in the farmer's clothes, in the pockets of the said clothes being the farmer's money. Now, though Georgie particularly wanted the farmer's nice clothes and nice horse, owing to a little transaction at the fair which made it desirable that he should not be too easily recognized, his desires had their bounds. He did not wish to take his young friend's money, at any rate more of it than was necessary for paying his bill. This he abstracted, and leaving the farmer's purse containing the rest on the bedroom table, went downstairs. The inn folks had not particularly noticed the faces of their customers, and the one or two who were up at this hour had no thought but that Georgie was the farmer. So when he had paid the bill very liberally and said he must be off, no objection was made to his getting the farmer's horse saddled for himself, and he rode away upon it as if it were his own. About half an hour after the young farmer awoke, and looking across the room saw that his friend Georgie had gone away in clothes which didn't belong to him, and had kindly left for himself the seedy ones worn by Georgie. At this he sat up in a deep thought for some time, instead of hastening to give an alarm. The money is gone," he said to himself, "and that's bad, but so are the clothes." He then looked upon the table and saw that the money, or most of it, had been left behind. "Ha, ha, ha!" he cried, and began to dance about the room. "Ha, ha, ha!" he said again, and made beautiful smiles to himself in the shaving-glass and in the brass candlestick, and then swung about his arms for all the world as if he were going through the sword exercise. When he had dressed himself in Georgie's clothes and gone downstairs, he did not seem to mind at all that they took him for the other, and even when he saw that he had been left a bad horse for a good one, he was not inclined to cry out. They told him his friend had paid the bill, at which he seemed much pleased, and without waiting for breakfast he mounted Georgie's horse and rode away likewise, choosing the nearest by-lane in preference to the high road, without knowing that Georgie had chosen that by-lane also. He had not trotted more than 2 miles in the personal character of Georgie Crookhill, when suddenly, rounding a bend that the lane made thereabout, he came upon a man struggling in the hands of 2 village constables. It was his friend Georgie, the borrower of his clothes and horse, but so far was the young farmer from showing any alacrity in rushing forward to claim his property that he would have turned the poor beast he rode into the wood adjoining, if he had not been already perceived. "Help! Help! Help!" cried the constables. "Assistance in the name of the Crown!" The young farmer could do nothing but ride forward. "What's the matter?" he inquired, as coolly as he could. "A deserter! A deserter!" said they. "One who's to be tried by court-martial and shot without parley. He deserted from the dragoons at Cheltenham some days ago, and was tracked, but the search party can't find him anywhere, and we told 'em if we met him we'd hand him on to them forthwith. The day after he left the barracks, the rascal met a respectable farmer, and made him drunk at an inn, and told him what a fine soldier he would make, and coaxed him to change clothes, to see how well a military uniform would become him. This the simple farmer did, when our deserter said that for a joke he would leave the room and go to the landlady to see if she should know him in that dress. He never came back, and Farmer Jollice found himself in soldier's clothes, the money in his pockets gone, and when he got to the stable his horse gone too. "A scoundrel!" says the young man in Georgie's clothes. "And is this the wretched caitiff?" pointing to Georgie. "No, no!" cries Georgie, as innocent as a babe of this matter of the soldier's desertion. "He's the man. He was wearing Farmer Jollice's suit of clothes, and he slept in the same room with me and brought up the subject of changing clothes, which put it into my head to dress myself in his suit before he was awake. He got on mine." "D'ye hear the villain?" groans the tall young man to the constables. "Trying to get out of his crime by charging the first innocent man with it that he sees. No, Master Soldier, that won't do." "No, no, that won't do," the constables chimed in. "To have the impudence to say such as that, when we caught him in the act almost. But, thank God, we've got the handcuffs on him at last." "We have, thank God," said the tall young man. "Well, I must move on. Good luck to ye with your prisoner." And off he went as fast as his poor jade could carry him. The constables then, with Georgie handcuffed between 'em and leading the horse, marched off in the other direction, toward the village where they had been accosted by the escort of soldiers sent to bring the deserter back, Georgie groaning, "I shall be shot, I shall be shot." They had not gone more than a mile before they met them. "Hoy there!" says the head constable. "Hoy yourself!" says the corporal in charge. "We've got your man," says the constable. "Where?" says the corporal. "Here, between us," said the constable, "only you don't recognize him out of uniform." The corporal looked at Georgie hard enough, then shook his head and said he was not the absconder. "But the absconder changed clothes with Farmer Jollice and took his horse, and this man has 'em, do you see?" "'Tis not our man," said the soldiers. "He's a tall young fellow with a mole on his right cheek and a military bearing, which this man decidedly has not." "I told the two officers of justice that 'twas the other," pleaded Georgie, "but they wouldn't believe me." And so it became clear that the missing dragoon was the tall young farmer and not Georgie Crookhill, a fact which Farmer Jollice himself corroborated when he arrived on the scene. As Georgie had only robbed the robber, his sentence was comparatively light. The deserter from the dragoons was never traced, his double shift of clothing having been of the greatest advantage to him in getting off, though he left Georgie's horse behind him a few miles ahead, having found the poor creature more hindrance than aid. The man from abroad seemed to be less interested in the questionable characters of Longpuddle and their strange adventures than in the ordinary inhabitants and the ordinary events, though his local fellow-travellers preferred the former as subjects of discussion. He now, for the first time, asked concerning young persons of the opposite sex, or rather those that had been young when he left his native land. His informants, adhering to their own opinion that the remarkable was better worth telling than the ordinary, would not allow him to dwell upon the simple chronicles of those who had merely come and gone. They asked him if he remembered Netty Sargent. "Netty Sargent? I do just remember her. She was a young woman living with her uncle when I left, if my childish recollection may be trusted." "That was the maid. She was a wonder, if you like, sir. Not any harm in her, you know, but up to everything. You ought to hear how she got the copyhold of her house extended. Oughtn't he, Mr. Day?" "He ought," replied the world-ignored old painter. "Tell him, Mr. Day. Nobody can do it better than you, and you know the legal part better than some of us." Day apologized and began. End of Story 17. Story 18 of Life's Little Ironies by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 18, Netty Sargent's Copyhold. She continued to live with her uncle in the lonely house by the copse, just as at the time you knew her, a tall, spry young woman. Ah, how well one can remember her black hair and dancing eyes at that time, and her sly way of screwing up her mouth when she meant to tease you. Well, she was hardly out of short frocks before the chaps were after her, and by long and by late she was courted by a young man whom perhaps you did not know. Jasper Cliff was his name, and though she might have had many a better fellow, he so greatly took her fancy that 'twas Jasper or nobody for her. He was a selfish customer, always thinking less of what he was going to do than of what he was going to gain by his doings. Jasper's eyes might have been fixed upon Netty, but his mind was upon her uncle's house, though he was fond of her in his way, I admit that. This house, built by her great-great-grandfather, with its garden and little field, was Copyhold, granted upon lives in the old way, and had been so granted for generations. Her uncle's was the last life upon the property, so that at his death, if there was no admittance of new lives, it would all fall into the hands of the lord of the manor. But 'twas easy to admit, a slight fine, as it was called, of a few pounds, was enough to entitle him to a new deed a grant by the custom of the manor, and the lord could not hinder it. Now there could be no better provision for his niece and only relative than a sure house over her head, and Netty's uncle should have seen to the renewal in time, owing to the peculiar custom of forfeiture by the dropping of the last life before the new fine was paid. For the squire was very anxious to get hold of the house and land, and every Sunday when the old man came into the church and passed the squire's pew, the squire would say, "A little weaker in his knees, a little crookeder in his back, and the readmittance not applied for. Ha! I shall be able to make a complete clearing of that corner of the manor some day." 'Twas extraordinary, now we look back upon it, that old Sargent should have been so dilatory. Yet some people are like that, and he put off calling at the squire's agent's office with the fine week after week, saying to himself, "I shall have more time next market day than I have now." One unfortunate hindrance was that he didn't very well like Jasper Cliff, and as Jasper kept urging Netty, and Netty on that account kept urging her uncle, the old man was inclined to postpone the reliving as long as he could, to spite the selfish young lover. At last old Mr. Sargent fell ill, and then Jasper could bear it no longer. He produced the fine money himself, and handed it to Netty, and spoke to her plainly. "You and your uncle ought to know better. You should press him more. There's the money. If you let the house and grounds slip between ye, I won't marry. Hang me if I will, for folks won't deserve a husband that can do such things." The worried girl took the money and went home, and told her uncle that it was no house, no husband for her. Old Mr. Sargent pooh-poohed the money, for the amount was not worth consideration, but he did now bestir himself, for he saw that she was bent upon marrying Jasper, and he did not wish to make her unhappy, since she was so determined. It was much to the squire's annoyance that he found Sargent had moved in the matter at last, but he could not gainsay it, and the documents were prepared, for on this manor the copyholders had writings with their holdings, though on some manors they had none. Old Sargent being now too feeble to go to the agent's house, the deed was to be brought to his house, signed and handed over, as a receipt for the money, the counterpart to be signed by Sargent and sent back to the squire. The agent had promised to call on old Sargent for this purpose at 5 o'clock, and Netty put the money into her desk to have it close at hand. While doing this, she heard a slight cry from her uncle, and turning round saw that he had fallen forward in his chair. She went and lifted him, but he was unconscious, and unconscious he remained. Neither medicine nor stimulants would bring him to himself. She had been told that he might possibly go off in that way, and it seemed as if the end had come. Before she had started for a doctor, his face and extremities grew quite cold and white, and she saw that help would be useless. He was stone dead. Netty's situation rose upon her distracted mind in all its seriousness. The house, garden, and field were lost by a few hours, and with them a home for herself and her lover. She would not think so meanly of Jasper as to suppose that he would adhere to the resolution declared in a moment of impatience, but she trembled nevertheless. Why could not her uncle have lived a couple of hours longer, since he had lived so long? It was now past 3 o'clock. At 5 the agent was to call, and if all had gone well, by 10 minutes past 5 the house and the holding would have been securely hers for her own and Jasper's lives, these being 2 of the 3 proposed to be added by paying the fine. How that wretched old squire would rejoice at getting the little tenancy into his hands! He did not really require it, but constitutionally hated these tiny copyholds and leaseholds and freeholds, which made islands of independence in the fair, smooth ocean of his estates. Then an idea struck into the head of Netty how to accomplish her object in spite of her uncle's negligence. It was a dull December afternoon, and the first step in her scheme, so the story goes, and I see no reason to doubt it. "'Tis true as the light," affirmed Christopher Twink. "I was just passing by." The first step in her scheme was to fasten the outer door, to make sure of not being interrupted. Then she set to work by placing her uncle's small, heavy oak table before the fire. Then she went to her uncle's corpse, sitting in the chair as he had died, a stuffed arm-chair on casters, and rather high in the seat, so it was told me, and wheeled the chair, uncle and all, to the table, placing him with his back toward the window, in the attitude of bending over the said oak table, which I knew as a boy as well as I know any piece of furniture in my own house. On the table she laid the large family Bible open before him, and placed his forefinger on the page, and then she opened his eyelids a bit, and put on him his spectacles, so that from behind he appeared for all the world as if he were reading the Scriptures. Then she unfastened the door and sat down, and when it grew dark she lit a candle and put it on the table beside her uncle's book. Folk may well guess how the time passed with her till the agent came, and how, when his knock sounded upon the door, she nearly started out of her skin. At least, that's as it was told me. Netty promptly went to the door. "I am sorry, sir," she says under her breath. "My uncle is not so well to-night, and I'm afraid he can't see you." "That's a pretty tale," says the steward. "So I've come all this way about this trumpery little job for nothing." "Oh, no, sir, I hope not," says Netty. "I suppose the business of granting the new deed can be done just the same?" "Done? Certainly not. He must pay the renewal money and sign the parchment in my presence." She looked dubious. "Uncle is so dreadful nervous about law business," says she, "that, as you know, he's put it off for years, and now to-day really I've feared it would verily drive him out of his mind. His poor 3 teeth quite chattered when I said to him that you would be here soon with the parchment writing. He always was afraid of agents and folks that come for rent and such like." "Poor old fellow, I'm sorry for him. Well, the thing can't be done unless I see him and witness his signature." "Suppose, sir, that you see him sign, and that he don't see you looking at him. I'd soothe his nerves by saying you weren't strict about the form of witnessing, and didn't wish to come in. So that it was done in your bare presence, it would be sufficient, would it not? And as he's an old, shrinking, shivering man, it would be a great considerateness on your part if that would do." "In my bare presence would do, of course. That's all I come for. But how can I be a witness without his seeing me?" "Why, in this way, sir, if you'll oblige me by just stepping here." She conducted him a few yards to the left, till they were opposite the parlour window. The blind had been left up purposely, and the candlelight shone out upon the garden bushes. Within, the agent could see, at the other end of the room, the back and side of the old man's head, and his shoulders and arm, sitting with the book and candle before him, and his spectacles on his nose, as she had placed him. "He's reading his Bible, as you see, sir," she says, quite in her meekest way. "Yes, I thought he was a careless sort of man in matters of religion." "He always was fond of his Bible," Netty assured him, "though I think he's nodding over it just at this moment. However, that's natural in an old man, and unwell. Now, you could stand here and see him sign, couldn't you, sir, as he's such an invalid?" "Oh, very well," said the agent, lighting a cigar. "You have ready by you the merely nominal sum you'll have to pay for the admittance, of course?" "Oh, yes," said Netty, "I'll bring it out." She fetched the cash, wrapped it in paper, and handed it to him, and when he had counted it, the steward took from his breast pocket the precious parchments and gave one to her to be signed. "Uncle's hand is a little paralyzed," she said, "and what with his being half asleep, too, really I don't know what sort of a signature he'll be able to make." "Doesn't matter, so that he signs." "May I hold his hand?" "Ay, hold his hand, my young woman, that will be near enough." Netty re-entered the house, and the agent continued smoking outside the window. Now came the ticklish part of Netty's performance. The steward saw her put the horn, says I in my old-fashioned way, the inkstand, before her uncle, and touch his elbow so as to arouse him, and speak to him, and spread out the deed. When she had pointed to show him where to sign, she dipped the pen and put it into his hand. To hold his hand, she artfully stepped behind him, so that the agent could only see a little bit of his head and the hand she held. But he saw the old man's hand trace his name on the document. As soon as 'twas done, she came out to the steward with the parchment in her hand, and the steward signed as witness by the light from the parlour window. Then he gave her the deed signed by the squire, and left. And next morning Netty told the neighbours that her uncle was dead in his bed. "She must have undressed him and put him there." "She must have. Oh, that girl had nerve, I can tell ye. Well, to cut a long story short, that's how she got back the house and field that were, strictly speaking, gone from her, and by getting them got her a husband. Every virtue has its reward, they say. Netty had hers for her ingenious contrivance to gain Jasper. 2 years after they were married he took to beating her, not hard, you know, just a smack or two, enough to set her in a temper, and let out to the neighbours what she had done to win him, and how she repented of all her pains. When the old squire was dead and his son came into the property, this confession of hers began to be whispered about. But Netty was a pretty young woman, and the squire's son was a pretty young man at that time, and wider-minded than his father, having no objection to little holdings, and he never took any proceedings against her. There was now a lull in the discourse, and soon the van descended the hill leading into the long straggling village. When the houses were reached, the passengers dropped off one by one, each at his or her own door. Arriving at the inn, the returned emigrant secured a bed, and having eaten a light meal, sallied forth upon the scene he had known so well in his early days. Though flooded with the light of the rising moon, none of the objects wore the attractiveness, in this their real presentation, that had ever accompanied their images in the field of his imagination when he was more than 2,000 miles removed from them. The peculiar charm attaching to an old village in an old country, as seen by the eyes of an absolute foreigner, was lowered in his case by magnified expectations from infantine memories. He walked on, looking at this chimney and that old wall, till he came to the churchyard, which he entered. The headstones, whitened by the moon, were easily decipherable, and now for the first time Lackland began to feel himself amid the village community that he had left behind him 35 years before. Here, besides the Sallets, the Darths, the Pauls, the Privets, the Sargents, and others of whom he had just heard, were names he remembered even better than those, the Jickses and the Crosses and the Knights and the Olds. Doubtless representatives of these families, or some of them, were yet among the living, but to him they would all be as strangers. Far from finding his heart ready supplied with roots and tendrils here, he perceived that in returning to this spot it would be incumbent upon him to re-establish himself from the beginning, precisely as though he had never known the place, nor it him. Time had not condescended to wait his pleasure, nor local life his greeting. The figure of Mr. Lackland was seen at the inn, and in the village street, and in the fields and lanes upon Upper Longpuddle for a few days after his arrival, and then, ghost-like, it silently disappeared. He had told some of the villagers that his immediate purpose in coming had been fulfilled by a sight of the place, and by conversation with its inhabitants, but that his ulterior purpose, of coming to spend his latter days among them, would probably never be carried out. It is now 12 or 15 years since his visit was paid, and his face has not again been seen. March 1891. End of Story 18. End of Life's Little Ironies, by Thomas Hardy.